Hello, human animal earthlings. It's great to have you joining us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. I'm host Carrie Freeman, coming to you from Atlanta in late February of 2026. And today we're exploring an ethical philosophy and view on life that might be new to a lot of people. It's called sentientism, where the focus of our concerns and policies is not just on human beings, but on all sentient beings. Basically, sentient beings are anyone who experiences consciousness and feelings of pleasure or pain and suffering. Namely, animals are sentient beings. Sentientism is described by our guest as, quote, a simple, potentially unifying philosophy or worldview. It commits to using evidence and applying reason and grants moral consideration to all sentient beings, unquote. To tell us about the compassionate philosophy of sentientism and its potential to improve our society's policies, science, agriculture, economics, culture, is our guest Jamie Woodhouse. Jamie is a former management consultant and current ski and racing coach in the UK who created the website Sentientism.info and is the host of the Sentientism podcast. In case you're looking it up, sentient is spelled Sentiient. And if you think we need a reset in our human-centered worldview because it's not working for life on this planet, this show will give you ideas for a positive worldview and policies to match. Welcome, Jamie.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Carrie. Thanks for the invite.
Well, first, I'm curious about your own path. How did a management consultant become instead a full-time philosopher?
Well, I'm not sure I'd really call myself a full-time philosopher. I like to think of myself as if you like, a common sense or an amateur philosopher. So I've been lucky to
Okay.
learn from lots of philosophers, but I'm not sure I really qualify as a professional myself. Um, but uh, I've always been fascinated by philosophy and by worldviews in particular. And by worldviews, I mean almost like the basics of your philosophy, the things that sit right at the bottom of your philosophy. If you keep asking the question why and why,
Yeah.
where do you ultimately end up? And quite often those worldviews are religious, sometimes they're non-religious worldviews like humanism. So I've always been fascinated by those ideas. But I guess I had a sort of normal job for a long while, nearly quarter of a century, that didn't really allow me as
Mm,
much time as I'd like to dig into those topics and think about their implications.
yeah.
So I spent quite a lot of time thinking about this stuff as a teenager, as a kid. I grew up Christian originally, and then went on my own sort of worldview journey. But then that fascination with worldviews was sort of put on hold for a long
Mm,
while I did a sort of normal corporate job. And I've just been very lucky to be able to bring that fascination back into the center of what I do now,
yeah.
partly out of my own intellectual curiosity, but also because I think worldviews are probably one of the most important
Mm.
things to get right because they underpin every decision anyone ever takes and they underpin every belief we have. So if there's something wrong with them, that can lead to deep problems. So I've come to think of
Yes.
worldviews as really, really important, almost foundational things for us humans to get right.
I totally agree with that. Like my last book was The Human Animal Earthling Identity, which has that same idea that your identity, which is all your value systems and your beliefs, drives everything. And so we wanted to include all humans and all other animals and then all earthlings, just so that we have a larger kind of in-group or moral circle, however you want to put it. So I think that we share a lot of similarities there in believing that's something we should all kind of work more at and just kind of explore in society. Well, how
Yeah,
would you Oh, go ahead.
and most of us are given our worldviews, right, by our parents or
Yeah,
by
we're
societies, and
cultivated.
then we sort of just don't look at them again. But they're still there in the back of our minds, guiding everything we do. So I think it's really important because they are so important, because they're so often unexamined, for us to pull them out into the light and have a look at them and pull them apart and put them back together again, and to really interrogate them and think about whether they're the worldviews we want to
Right.
hold or not.
Yeah, and even a religious worldview is inherited by your family usually, and then you can question it and decide to keep it, reinterpret it, or move on, which is kind of what you did, and I did the same thing, just examining my ethical worldview kind of in college. Well, how would you explain the philosophy of sentientism and what makes it different from mainstream ethical worldviews that we tend to have in Western society?
So when you tend to think of worldviews, most people will immediately think of religious worldviews:
Yes.
Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam. There's the long list goes on, and modern scholars of religion think there might be thousands of different religions depending on how you slice them up. So there's religious worldviews, and then there are non-religious worldviews. So people might be familiar with worldviews like humanism. So in a way, sentientism is another worldview that you put on the menu alongside all of those other ones. So one thing that I think is similar is that all of those worldviews are really trying to answer some of the same deep philosophical questions, those sort of root questions I was hinting at earlier on. And they're questions like, not just what is true or what is real, how do we work out what is true and what is real? What toolkit should we use to really
Yeah.
understand this amazing universe we all share? And then, just as importantly, I think those worldviews are trying to answer the fundamental ethical questions of what matters and who matters and how can we lead a good life and what do good and bad and right and wrong even mean. I think all of those worldviews are trying to
Yeah.
ultimately answer those two deep questions, although they build a lot of stuff on top of it as well. So, to summarize sentientism, I'd say it in one sentence: as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So when we're working out what to believe or how to understand the world, sentientism is a little weird in that it doesn't tell us any specific beliefs at all. So
Mm.
most worldviews will tell you what to believe. There's a list of things that you are supposed to believe
Yeah,
if you
these
have that
are
worldview.
the duties, these are the virtues. Yeah.
Yeah, or the facts, the things you're
Yes.
supposed to believe, the resurrection of Christ or the
Ah,
existence of a deity, or there are certain facts that you're supposed to accept as well. And sentientism doesn't have any of those. It just says what we should do to try and understand the universe is to use evidence and reason to understand the world. So that evidence is broadly understood as information from reality. It might be scientific, it might be our own experiences, it might be from different sources, but let's use information from the world and then reason intelligently to try and understand reality. But we should always be humble. We should be open
yeah.
minded. We should think critically. We should always avoid dogma. We should never be too sure we're right. We should always be doubting. We should always be ready to change our mind when the evidence changes. So, quite often, that involves shifting from ideas of perfect proof or belief to
Mm.
maybe credences, which is like how confident am I this thing is true? And when you start saying how confident am I, it makes it easier for you to move your confidence up and down. So that's roughly the evidence and reason side.
Yeah.
So whether we're thinking about does this table here exist, or is the Earth flat, or are vaccines effective, or um, you know, whatever the factual question might be, do gods exist? Sentientism doesn't tell us the answer, but it does tell us to use evidence and reason, a good faith attempt to use evidence and reason to work that out. And then on the ethical side, it's quite open minded about what sort of ethical system you apply. And
Okay.
depending on how interested your listeners are in philosophy, there's so many different ways of working out what right and wrong and good and bad mean. There can be rights or welfare or utility or virtue or feminist care ethics. There's loads of different ways of, or relational ethics. And sentientism is quite open minded about which we use, but it does insist quite strongly on an answer to the who matters question, which is
Yeah.
often neglected in moral philosophy.
Yes.
People will just unthinkingly assume that all humans matter, or they will unthinkingly assume that even a subgroup of humans matter, and then they go off and do their ethical thinking, but they forget to question why those people or those beings should matter. So sentientism says we should have compassion for all sentient beings, and as you were saying in the intro, a sentient being is a being that can feel or can experience. Any being that has interest, that has a perspective, a being for whom things can go well or badly. And the moral hook is to say, well, if morality is about whether and how we care for others or care about others, then we should care about all others who have their own interest or perspective. And if
Yeah.
things matter to you, Carrie, if I want to call myself moral, I should care about
Yes.
those things because they matter to you. So you should matter to me because you matter to yourself. And if you matter to yourself in any way whatsoever, you are a sentient being. And that might be, quite a rich way of measuring. You might have existential angst, you might feel love, you might feel hope, you might have complex plans for the future, or you might just matter in a very basic way of feeling simple pains and pleasures that matter to you. And sentientism says it doesn't matter how rich or complex your sentience might be, your experience might be. If you feel or value anything at all, you should matter to us and you should matter seriously. So that's the evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings, answering the question of how do we understand the world, and then who should matter.
And I think there's also a lot of worldviews, religions and worldviews or that are more communal, like Ubuntu, out of a lot of African cultures, that is like I am because you are, meaning like I it's not about just me and individualism, it's about all of us and being compassionate and neighborly. So then sentientism just kind of says, and I am because you are, but doesn't have to be like I am only what only neighbors with other humans, but like you could expand it out. And so I do think this could just be an expansion of, like you talked about, utilitarian ethics or, feminist ethics or anything social justice concerns, just expanded to include others who rightly deserve to be there, because one of the main reasons we care about humans is because we are someone, and we have a sense of things that's different from a rock or some of the plants in my house who are living things but are not in quite the same way. But then when we have dogs and cats, like I have a dog sitting behind me now, we recognize that that is someone in our life that is pretty different from um, some of the plants in the house, even though I have to care for both of them. So we already have a concern for other animals, but we're just so strict about that human boundary, and we've let it limit our caretaking for, I think, way too long.
Yeah. And that's a good way into it, even for people who haven't really thought about this radical expansion of our moral scope, because I think we care about other human beings because
Yes.
we're sentient. We
Yeah.
don't care about other beings because we happen to be the same species or because we happen to look the same. Um, ultimately, that's not why I would care about you or my friends or my family or a distant human on the other side of the planet. It's not because of those uh, characteristics or qualities or species designation. Those are just as morally irrelevant to me as race or class or gender or sexual
Yeah.
preference or caste or anything else, right? So I think even most people who care about humans, when you ask, okay, but why do you care about
Yeah.
humans? Well, ultimately agree it's because they're sentient beings. And as
Yes.
soon as that's why you care for somebody else, you have to care about all of the sentient beings.
Right.
Any exclusion of a sentient being is it's arbitrary, right? You're making it up for no reason. So that was partly my path to thinking
Yeah.
this through. I think it's almost unavoidable. If you care about any suffering, you have to care about all suffering. And if you care
Yeah.
about any sentient being, you sort of have to care about them all. So let's
Right.
just do that.
Yeah, to be fair. Now, I think sentientism is largely a philosophy that I follow, even though I don't often use that term sentientism. Even though I talk about animal sentience a lot, I'm more likely to talk about animal rights or animal liberation, or I might talk about being a deep ecologist or an ecofeminist, or I like the term interspecies justice. What do you think of those terms in comparison to sentientism? And for me, I mean, animal rights is kind of the big term that parallels with this, I would think, in terms of a movement or a belief system.
Yeah. I'd probably break those terms into two chunks. And the first would be animal rights
Right.
and interspecies justice. And I forgot the other one you
Oh,
talked
like
about.
ecofeminism and deep ecology would maybe be together in more of an
Yeah.
environmental camp.
Yeah, exactly. So the animal rights one's an interspecies justice one. So I think I'll clump together first because one of the things that sentientism insists is that it's not enough just to have a sort of tokenistic compassion for all sentient beings or to say we care. We actually that has to be serious. It has to
Yeah.
have teeth. That has to have a moral baseline implication. And the baseline that sentientism suggests is that at the very least, we should not needlessly harm, exploit, or kill any sentient being. So we just sort of draw that baseline and say, look, that's the absolute minimum obligation we should have to any sentient
Yeah.
being. Because if I say I care about you, or I have a compassion for you, or I want to treat you humanely, for those words to mean anything at all, they should at least mean I wouldn't harm, exploit, or kill you without a really powerful overriding justification.
Yeah.
Otherwise, those words lose their meaning completely.
Right.
So it draws that quite strong baseline, and technically, in philosophy terms, that's called non-maleficence, which is basically just don't do bad stuff to me.
Yeah.
So it's like a minimal ask, right? of course, if you really have compassion for someone, you would layer a lot more on top of that. You might want to help or be benevolent or to assist or
Yeah.
support in all sorts of ways. But at the very least, you would see harming, exploiting, or killing
Yeah.
as a
And I
negative, right? So
think
it's
that's
always that
why,
baseline.
like an animal, especially when we call it animal liberation or animal freedom or interspecies justice, we're kind of talking about just don't hurt me. Like, give me the
Yeah,
rights to not be exploited in, factory farms and in experimentation labs and all of these kinds of things. But it doesn't necessarily, although rights maybe is a little bit broader than saying freedom from oppression.
yeah,
And when we say animal rights, there is a sense that there's an obligation to do something maybe positive. But that, yeah, it's
yeah,
always true that how benevolent we have to be, how much we have to help others is maybe always an open question, right? In society. So with our laws, we are usually more concerned about what can you not do to me? Yeah.
yeah. That's like the most important thing to
Yeah.
lock in first, right? I might argue that you should help me in various ways, but the most important things for me to lock in is I don't want you to kill me. I don't want you to hurt me. There are certain basic things
Yeah.
I don't want you to do to me. So I think the link between the sentientist way of thinking and the terms you raised is pretty strong because one of the best ways of enforcing that sort of non-maleficence baseline into putting our compassion into practice is to recognize the rights of other sentient beings,
Yeah.
particularly those negative rights not to be harmed, exploited, or killed, and so on. And then, like you say, you can go beyond that into positive rights. So I think it can feed into a rights perspective. Although some sentientists don't go down a rights path. They
Mhm.
might take a feminist care ethics path or a virtue ethics path or a utilitarian path. But as long as they do that seriously, such as you still wouldn't needlessly harm, exploit, or kill, I think it still fits. So rights is absolutely one path. And I think for most rights thinkers, and if you look at work by people like Tom Reagan, who are seen as sort of seminal thinkers in the rights space, ultimately I think the rights are grounded in sentience.
Yes.
Because the
Yes.
reason of being, you know, needs rights to protect them and has rights is because of their sentience. And then when you ask the questions about, okay, and which rights do they need as a being, it depends on the nature of their sentience.
Right.
Um, because I think different beings can benefit from different
Then you get
rights.
a little bit into Martha Nussbaum and like the capabilities approach, like that we all
Yeah,
don't need the same thing. Like Elliot, my dog, doesn't need education and voting rights and stuff, but he does need to have, his well-being looked after and to not be exploited and to be
yeah,
have some richness and flourishing in his life and to, to be happy. So, right, it's always species. Sometimes people, yeah, make fun of animal rights, like, we're asking for the exact same things, but it's always species specific or maybe individual specific, because also each
yeah.
individual within species might have different needs based on their capabilities. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think a similar thing runs true for liberation because when we talk about liberation from oppression,
Yeah.
that's sort of obvious, right? Oppression is bad. We all want to be free from it. But it doesn't mean that freedom always overrides everything, just as it doesn't with us humans, right? We humans like freedom because we tend to not like being
Yeah.
constrained, and quite often because we're best placed to take decisions for our own benefit. So it's good that we're free to do that. But there are some situations in which it does make sense to constrain our freedom, sometimes
Yeah.
for our own benefit. So
There's, yeah, we're
liberation from
balancing it with
oppression,
security all the time or safety, like freedom versus
yeah,
safety is a classic tension in
yeah.
society and law. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd say it's not completely unconditional, libertarian freedom at all costs, even if it
Yeah.
causes enormous suffering. But liberation from oppression, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That runs through quite closely. So then the second chunk you talked about, I think there is a relationship there, but it's a more tense relationship in a way. So sentientism doesn't say we can't or shouldn't care about plants and fungi,
Yeah.
assuming they're alive but not sentient. And it doesn't say we shouldn't care about ecosystems, but it does insist that all of the sentient beings must be granted compassion. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
And the reason that's insisted on is because most of the people who talk about an ecocentric point of view where they care about ecosystems,
Yeah.
or a biocentric point of view where they say they care about all living things, whether or not they're sentient, or the environmental movement as a whole, is that the center of gravity of those movements actually conveniently excludes most of the sentient beings from moral consideration.
Right. Except
So
for
most of the
humans.
wild, yeah, so
Yeah, they
humans
grant
have,
us a pass for in environmental
and
sense, there's no reason to grant humans a pass as a species that we're not giving individual rights to any other species but us, and we're the most damaging species, so it makes the least sense.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. And when you see that pattern happening, it becomes very clear that those views aren't really biocentric or ecocentric at all. They're just another veneer on anthropocentrism and human
Yes.
centricity because their concern for the environment is really about we want nature to be pretty, we want a reliable temperature, we want ecosystem services, but it's all really about our human needs.
Yeah.
Whereas if someone has an environmental perspective and they have a deep moral compassion for all of the farmed and lab and exploited animals,
Yeah.
and they don't just care about the charismatic wild animals, but they care
Yeah.
about all of the wild animals as individuals, that's a genuine type of biocentrism or ecocentrism where their circle of moral scope has genuinely expanded out, but includes everybody now. It hasn't
Yeah.
conveniently excluded most of the non human sentient beings. So sentientism is open to that good faith sort of expansion as long as the sentient beings all get moral consideration.
Yeah.
But even so, it still insists that if someone is a biocentrist or an ecocentrist and grants direct moral consideration way beyond sentience, that there's something special about sentience that should still give sentient beings priority. Because ultimately, I think there's a deep moral difference between putting a knife into a carrot and putting a knife into a pig or a fish, right? Because
Right.
I don't think the carrot is alive, right? But it cannot experience anything. The carrot doesn't care or can't care either way what we've done to them, done to
Yeah.
it. Whereas the fish or the chicken or the human or the pig absolutely does. They feel and experience that, and their interest in continuing to live is cut short. So even if we go really expansive with our moral concern, we
Yeah.
genuinely care about a tree as a moral patient in their own right, I would still say sentience has got to count seriously and give an extra level of importance to the sentient beings because there
Yeah.
can be a danger of a sort of moral flattening. I think if you really push an ecocentric view a long, long way, you can
It's
almost get to a point where someone will say, "Well, look, everything matters,
yeah,
right?"
total
That
species equality, and then you can't like you're pitting a blade of grass against, you know, a squirrel or
exactly.
something, and it's like, well,
And I've
yeah.
had people give that argument to me. They will say ultimately everything matters, not just the living things, but the ecosystems, the rocks, the rivers,
Yeah.
the mountains. Everything matters, and it feels like a really generous moral scope. You care about absolutely everything,
And then
but
you start
then
to
the people
problem solve and there's no
distinguish.
way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes the conversation will end up with someone saying, "Well, but we humans should humbly play our part in those ecosystems. Um, you know, life begets life and life consumes life. Predation is part of a natural
Yeah.
ecosystem. So I'm going to have a Big Mac." And I'm like, oh, hold on, something's
Yeah.
something's gone wrong here. You've
Yeah.
ethically flattened to such a degree that nothing matters at all. And yeah,
And I
so
think
those are the concerns about going beyond sentience.
I'm realizing often that I talk in my work about like looking at anthropocentric discourse and wanting it to be more biocentric. But and I explain that biocentric is life-centered, but what I really think I'm meaning is sentient because I specify I'm really talking about other animal beings and but I do care for ecosystems, but I care for other animal beings as individuals and I tend to care for ecosystems and habitats and plant-based environments on a utility base, like that they are the life support system for all the sentient beings. So I'm saying biocentrism, but I'm still privileging the sentient beings within, but I'm also saying that we need a healthy, environment, and all of us do.
Absolutely.
And so, but anyway, so
And
I'm
that's
using a very
and
broad term, I think because it people can understand it. And sentientism is a term that hasn't maybe caught on as much. So I haven't tended to use it, even though I think that's what I mean, you know?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right because I think along of very similar lines. Because one, if you are serious about biocentrism, i.e., granting moral consideration to every living entity, that doesn't just mean the blades of grass. That means bacteria, right? So you can get into
Hmm.
some really difficult ethical
Yeah,
positions about whether
very
you
different.
should take you know, is taking an antibiotic some form of brutal biocide that could never be justified. I'm like, I think we've
Yeah, that's
we've gone
a
too far
bit
because
too
I don't think a
far.
bacteria can feel anything. But the more important point, exactly as you said, some people will criticize sentientism and say, look, if you only care about the sentient beings, we will disregard the environments we're part of. And I'm like, no, absolutely not, because any evidence and reason based understanding
Yeah.
of our world shows how deeply important a rich, thriving, biodiverse
Yes.
environment is for all the sentient beings. But there is an important difference between caring about the environment for the environment's sake and caring about the environment because it's so important to all of the sextillion, sentient beings that might be living on this planet.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important difference. But absolutely,
Yeah.
a sentientist would, as I do, right, would absolutely share a really rich, powerful environmental concern, because
Right.
things aren't going to go well for us sentient beings without it. So
Absolutely. If you're just joining us on Radio Free Georgia, this is In Tune to Nature, and I'm host Carrie Freeman talking about the compassionate and reason-based philosophy called Sentientism, which is showing equitable concern for all animals as feeling beings. Something that is well reflected in the viewpoint of mine here on In Tune to Nature. And our guest is Jamie Woodhouse. He's joining us from London. He hosts the Sentientism podcast and the website Sentientism.info. Sentient is spelled Sentiient. Okay, Jamie, let's talk about what it would mean for society if we enacted a worldview that equitably values sentience in all animals. What would that mean for us, or like how would we run our institutions and policies differently? And I like on your sentientism.info website that you've got a sentientism in action section that has like, oh, education and agriculture and, that culture and finance, and lists all these different things. Um, we've already touched on this a little bit, but how would sentientism impact environmental policies, do you think? Like if we're saying, okay, let's say we have a sentient worldview, or most of our society has that, then what kind of environmental policies would we humans have that are maybe a little bit different than what we have right now?
So it's a good extension from what we were just talking about, because I think why we care about the environment is as important as whether we care about the environment. So from a sentientist perspective, we would care about the environment because of its importance and value to all of the different sentient beings. So that would mean that as we're thinking about intervening in the environment, and intervening is unavoidable because we're already doing it at a global scale.
Yeah.
So the question about whether we intervene or not is a somewhat moot,
It's
right? We
too
already
late.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah. The question becomes, for whose benefit are we making changes,
Mhm.
withdrawing or intervening or doing certain things? And we would be aspiring to consider the interests of all of the sentient beings involved.
Yeah.
So, whereas a typical environmental stance might, as we were hinting at earlier on, be very focused on the human interests, right? So, if you read the
Yeah.
Sustainable Development Goals, all of those are oriented around making the planet a safe, happy, healthy place for humans to live. That's really the reason the SDGs are
Yeah.
there, right? So one thing you'd see in a traditional environmental approach is human-centric interests. The other
Yeah.
thing you might see is seeing the environment and nature as intrinsically good in its own right.
Yeah.
And a sentientist stance tends to be a little bit skeptical of that, because quite often nature, even without humans being involved, is a pretty mixed place for sentient beings that are out there. There's lots of joy and flourishing and family life, but there's lots of brutality and suffering and disease and starvation and
Mhm.
death and predation as well, right? So nature is not an intrinsically perfect moral place for all of the sentient beings that are out there. So I think that would be one corrective that a sentientist stance would bring in. Um, and on the so it will be guided by that aspiration to try and make environmental changes or stop making bad environmental changes for the benefit of all sentient beings. But that also means that we're less likely to be willing to sacrifice sentient beings for the
Yes.
purposes of the environment. So,
Yes.
the current default human approach is, oh, look, there are some deer, eating those crops or chewing those saplings down. Let's go and kill them all.
Yeah. A
And
lethal,
basically,
immediately lethal
yeah, whenever
response.
there's a human or even environmental conflict with non-human animal interests, the default human approach is kill them all, right? That's
Yeah.
pretty much where we go. So a sentientist approach wouldn't say, look, there's always a magically easy answer here. There
Yeah.
might be some difficult trade-offs, there might be some hard choices, but we have to seriously take the interests of all of those sentient beings into
Yeah.
account. And that would mean you'd ask questions like, is this actually an important harm that's being done in the first place, or is it just something that's annoying some humans? Um, and if there are genuine issues, you would want to intervene in a way that balances interests more intelligently. So maybe you would look at less intensive ways of intervening. You might look at wildlife corridors or fencing or contraception instead of culling. Or, I
Yes.
mean, at the very least, you would think more creatively about less harmful solutions than the current default environmental approach. And I think the other
Yeah.
broad thing is that this what's technically called an epistemological commitment, this evidence and reason commitment, means that we wouldn't be guided by um, maybe traditional ideas about nature or mystical ideas about nature or wishful thinking about nature or disinformation or conspiracy theories. We would be guided by using evidence and reason to try and understand the world that we're operating in on the environment and what our interventions might do to that. So we would want a broadly scientifically based approach, a research based approach,
Yeah.
one that's humble and open minded to guide our interventions. Whereas a lot of environmentalism tends to be a bit knee jerk, tends to be a bit wishful thinking, and tends to be very driven by human concerns. So hopefully that gives a
Yeah.
sense of. I think there will be some things we probably do in a similar way, and some things we do in a in a radically different way. Ultimately, because the reason we care about the environment is because of the sentient beings, not the other way around.
Yeah, if we were always saying not just like should we build this road to allow, some mining or something and being worried about some potential pollution or something of human waterways or ruining the whole environment, we still would have those concerns, but I think if you're a sentientist, you'd be much less likely to build the road because you're really thinking more about the turtles and the lizards or anybody else who's affected by that road negatively. And you're not going to find much benefit to those individuals from this road that we want usually for human reasons, even if you can diminish some of the overall, environmental harms or whatever. So, yeah, I like the idea. It aligns somewhat with compassionate conservation as a movement, which is something I've talked about on the show, or even a notion of environmental justice that goes beyond just justice for humans, that says, I'm not just going to look at the deer and say, oh, well, they're overpopulated, quote unquote, relative to what's left of the habitat we've given them, but say, well, also we're overpopulated too, and but we're not going to just start culling ourselves for that reason. Like we're going to grant them some of the same courtesies we would grant us in terms of problem solving this. And maybe we need to give them more habitat, or yes, maybe we need to reintroduce natural predators, although that wouldn't necessarily be something the deer would want. But yeah, like, as you mentioned, contraception instead of hunting or whatever. But we wouldn't have an environmental policy that was just geared towards making sure the deer were always overpopulated so that the sporting and hunting, recreationalists would have something to do. So, yeah, it's just, I like the idea of compassionate conservation. I've really gotten into it, and it's a basis of my next book project about wildlife coexistence because it
Oh,
says
cool.
we should care about the individuals and not just look at the quote unquote population, because that's what we do, for each other. And some
Yeah,
of
I
this,
mean,
oh, go ahead.
if you imagined an alien species observing Earth and thinking,
Uh,
well, as long as the human population is relatively stable and self-sustaining, we don't care if anyone's suffering or dying. We'd be like, that's a pretty weird way of you know judging whether things are okay or not
yes.
from our perspective as individuals on the inside. But that's largely how we look at wild animal species. It's right. We don't really care what's happening to the individuals at all, as long as they fit some sort of human view of what
Yeah.
the aesthetics of nature should look like, right? Healthy populations and species diversity, and we care about scarce animals. And but as soon
Yes,
as the
right.
population's healthy, we're quite happy
We
to start
only,
shooting them
you're
again.
right. And I love to point that out that we tend to only care about individuals of other animal species if they're endangered, which is usually our
Yeah,
fault. And then we care about them. But I really that's why I really like all the biologists who and ethologists, and some of them have been, I know on your Sentientism podcast that help us understand how unique all the animal cultures are and how the different members of a animal society like a wolf pack, or which is like more of like a family, how they're each necessary, and someone can't just go, oh, we could have, two or 5% less wolves and then just kill any five wolves or something. Like, no, a whole family of wolves could die because you killed these particular alpha wolves. We just cannot treat them as interchangeable units. And so they have, yeah, and I feel like that's what we do. We certainly do it on a factory farm and in other ways, but we do it in nature as well.
Yeah.
Um, Now, we're running close on our time, but was there anything you wanted to say about how our political system might need to change too? Like, we'll have animal parties. I know we don't have one here in the United States, but when I'm over in Europe, in almost any country, I'll see like a poster for an animal party. So there's some members of parliament who represent animal interests. Now, there's not enough of them that get into all the different parliaments, but I'm like, I love that they're there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an indicator of where we might go with these ideas because if you take any worldview seriously, it revolutionizes almost every area of human thought. So, as you
Yeah.
said, you can run thought experiments about economics and culture and language and uh, history and education and all of our production systems and technology and reimagine them in this context where we're using evidence and reason to try and understand the world and we're extending our moral consideration to all sentient beings as well. It has a sort of revolutionary impact on all of those spaces. But politics, I think, is a particularly interesting one because it's not just about getting humans to care about non-human animals. That's obviously an important part of it, but that's not everything. So a political system that was grounded in sentientism, one, it would use evidence and reason to guide all of the political thinking. So you'd see
Yeah.
experimentation, you'd see decent quality science, you'd see research, you'd see good epistemics, you'd see that running through into the way kids are taught how to do critical thinking. So you wouldn't see politics driven by conspiracy theories or
Ugh.
disinformation or theocracy wouldn't have any particular place in a sentientist politics, or dogmatic ways of thinking in politics. So that evidence and reason thing would be a really important influence through all of the human politics, let alone beyond.
Yeah.
But then you're right, the really radical thing is extending our moral scope to all sentient beings means they need to be represented in our
Yes.
politics as well. So does our democracy need to become a sentiocracy? And you get into some really interesting thoughts about what are we saying that shrimp should be given the vote, and does that mean they'd
Yeah.
outvote us all? And a lot of these questions are really tough, right? It can be
Yeah.
mind blowing to even get your head around it, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And in the same way as we already children, for example, don't get the right to vote in our political systems, but we do represent them in our
Yes.
politics, right? We
That's
know they
true.
matter. Future generations can't vote in our politics,
Yes.
but in Wales and I think New Zealand and a couple of other places, they have representatives for future generations in their
Yes. That's
political systems.
great.
And as you say, there is already some recognition that non-human sentient beings matter, normally tokenistically in a sort of welfare way in some of our politics, but then there are animal parties that are trying to push that harder. But that would explode the scope of our politics, that the point of our politics has to be about making the world better for all of the sentient beings, not for just the humans.
Yeah.
And where that takes you, that can take you to some pretty radical, crazy ideas, but
And
fascinating things that we need to wrestle with.
I do think like if we're thinking about this is kind of sentientism is about human kind of governance. Like we're not saying that the squirrels, I keep mentioning squirrels because I love them. Um, the squirrels or dogs or bears or fish have to be sentientist, but because we can't control how they're going to live their lives, but we can to some extent organize how we live our lives. And so you could argue maybe we didn't have that much obligation to think as much about all sentient beings if we didn't have a big impact on them and we weren't hurting them and taking over the world like we do and putting roads and pollution everywhere and changing the climate, then, maybe we could argue, well, we could be a little more anthropocentric, but that's not the case. Like we have dominated, we've used most of the world for our agriculture and and we fish everywhere and we deplete everything. And so we are extremely damaging. We don't want to be, but we are as a species. I mean, and not all human cultures are equally, damaging, but anyway, so I guess I want to put that out there too, that it's a moral obligation when you do cause harm to have compensation or reparations for that. And so in a way that other species wouldn't necessarily be obligated to do.
Yeah, and it's part of the legitimacy of politics, right? If you're impacted, you deserve to be represented, and non-human
Yeah.
animals are impacted. And quite often, it depends how broadly you want to think about the term politics, but in some ways, animals do already engage in forms of politics. They resist, they express their
Yes.
opinions through their expressions and through their activities and through their behaviors and through their movement. And there's some interesting thinking amongst philosophers like Eva Meyer, who I interviewed recently, who are even thinking about the idea of whether you could bring non-human animals into ideas like citizens' assemblies to actually engage with
Ooh.
non-human animals to understand what it is they really need and want. And again, you've got to be careful here because us humans are always tempted to sort of impose our
Yeah.
views of what non-human animals want. But if you do that in a genuine way, there could be some quite interesting thought experiments about how to help non-human animals express themselves in political ways too.
Beckoff and Bexel and Freeman, that's me, and several other scientists wrote a paper about giving other animals a voice in the media, like news media. And so we were thinking through those kinds of questions, like what does it mean for journalists to use other animals as sources? And sometimes it is by interacting with them individually, if that's safe and appropriate, and trying to read their beliefs about being in a farm or being by a high living by a highway or something. But other times it's that we need ethologists, like Mark Beckoff and or Jonathan Balcom and other people to help us understand what the animal's interests and needs are.
Yeah.
And there's other times, yeah, again, just that we as regular journalists and people can just be more in tune and empathetic and recognize and open our eyes to these kinds of things. And so anyway, so that was just another thing with the animalsandmedia.org well, it led into the animalsandmedia.org site is just about yeah, how can we represent the interests of other animals in the news? Because when we have any kind of sprawl or almost any kind of policy, it impacts other animals. And if they're not reflected, like when there's a wildfire or any kinds of things, we do need to bring them in. So what does that mean? So that's part of what, to me, fair journalism is, to be diverse and include a lot of perspectives. It also means bringing in others. So yeah, how could that be done even in a government setting? You know, and I think it was Melanie Challenger that has that group Animals in the Room, I think it's called. Yeah, which is about how do you bring other animals into the decision-making process. Again, since we impact them, they deserve to have, some say in these things. Okay, wrap up question, Jamie, for anyone listening who either wants to investigate the ethical philosophy of sentientism further, or maybe they want to start putting it into practice in their lives and communities, where would you suggest they start or something they could do?
Well, I'd love to continue the conversation. So please do reach out to me personally if people are interested in asking questions or sharing some
Yeah,
feedback or some ideas. But the easiest place to go is probably our Sentientism.info website. Uh, so that has links to absolutely everything else. Within
yeah,
that, you'll find links to the YouTube and the podcast. And those include some presentations where I've explained sentientism to groups. So there's some good overviews of sentientism there. But most of the episodes are me interviewing other people,
yeah,
celebrities, philosophers, scientists, creatives about their
yeah,
own worldview journey and where they've ended up. But so I've been lucky to have some amazing guests there,
yeah.
including Mark Beckoff, who you mentioned earlier on, and Jonathan Balcom. So the YouTube and the podcast. And then the final thing will be our community groups. So we
Oh,
run a range of open community groups centered on the sentientism idea on pretty much every platform you can imagine. So whether you're on Facebook or Discord or Telegram or Signal or Blue Sky, if you search for sentientism, you'll find us there with
oh,
social media accounts and groups. And the groups are open to absolutely anyone interested in these sorts of ideas. There's no gatekeeping. You don't have to
okay.
become a sentientist to join.
Yeah.
But if you're interested in these ideas, whether you agree with them or not, come and join the conversation.
Oh, I like that. And again, the website is sentientism.info, sentientism.info as kind of a good place to start. And you have reading lists there and lots of other things. But I do think the podcasts are kind of an enjoyable way to engage, like you said. Well, that's the end of our show, but I want to thank you, Jamie Woodhouse, for being with us on Radio Free Georgia's In Tune to Nature program. Thanks for your dedication to promoting this compassionate worldview of sentientism, where we as humans could create more fairness and well-being in the world for all animals as fellow sentient beings.
It's such a pleasure, Carrie. Thanks so much. And it's been an honor to talk to your audience too.
Oh, thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in Tune to Nature, broadcasting every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, online at wrfg.org and on Atlanta radio station 89.3 FM. I record from Atlanta in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in the Muskogee Creek territory and former range of the Red Wolf, now home to some coyote families and a million squirrels, as I mentioned. You can access action items, news, and podcasts on the show's website, wrfg.org/intune to nature. The views and opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily reflect those of WRFG, its board staff, or volunteers. I'm one of those volunteers. I'm host Carrie Freeman, asking you to please support independent, non-commercial media like Radio Free Georgia at wrfg.org. And remember to take care of yourself and others, including other species, especially fellow sentient beings and the shared habitats that sustain us. Thank you for listening. Cheers.